The story begins on a cold afternoon in March 2019, in the small town of Asheville, North Carolina. Dorothy Mae Johnson, at 80 years old, was sitting in the living room of her modest house when the mailman brought an official envelope. With trembling hands, she called her granddaughter Sarah, 25 years old, a newly graduated teacher who was spending a few days with her after spring break. "Honey, can you read this for Grandma?" she asked with that sweet voice that hid decades of shame for not being able to read. Sarah opened the envelope and her face instantly turned pale. It was an eviction notice. According to the document, Dorothy had sold her house 3 months ago to a real estate development company and had only 30 days to vacate the property where she had lived for more than 50 years. But Dorothy would never sell that house. It was all she had. It was where she had raised her 5 children after being widowed while still young, working as a housekeeper in hotels and restaurants. "Grandma, did you sign any papers for Uncle Robert recently?" Sarah asked, already feeling the weight of family betrayal. Dorothy put her hand to her chest. Robert, her middle son, always came with papers for her to sign. "It's just for your Social Security, Mama. It's to renew your Medicare card. It's for you to get a government benefit." She trusted blindly. He was her son, why would she doubt him? With teary eyes, Dorothy confessed. "He brought some papers last month, said it was for the doctor's office. I did what I always do. I made my mark the way I learned as a girl." Sarah felt a deep rage rising in her chest, but hugged her grandmother and promised, "We're gonna fix this, Grandma. I promise you." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She stayed up researching, calling lawyers from the Legal Aid Society, trying to understand how to reverse that situation. Everyone said the same thing. It would be difficult to prove that Dorothy didn't know what she was signing, especially because she could sign her own name. The signature was there, authentic, notarized. Technically, she had sold the house for a ridiculously low amount. Only $15,000, when the property was worth at least $180,000. At dawn, Sarah found her grandmother already awake, sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the open envelope. "You know what hurts the most, baby? It ain't losing the house. It's finding out my own son robbed me because he knew I couldn't read what I was signing. He used my shame against me." Dorothy then paused, wiped her tears and said something that would change everything. "Sarah, I'm gonna learn to read. I don't know how much time I got left, but I'm gonna die knowing what's written on papers people put in front of me. Nobody's ever gonna fool me like this again." Sarah saw determination in those eyes tired by life. It wasn't just about recovering the house. It was about dignity, about recovering power over her own life that illiteracy had stolen from her for 8 decades. It was about all the time she pretended to be looking for her glasses when someone handed her a menu in restaurants. About all the signs she couldn't read on the roads. About all the moments when she had to ask for help and feel less than others. And so began a journey that no one imagined possible. To understand the strength of Dorothy's decision, we need to go back in time. She was born in 1939, on a small sharecropping farm in rural Mississippi, during the segregation era. She was the oldest of 9 siblings. Her family worked from sunrise to sunset on a white farmer's cotton plantations, and little was left for themselves. The school for black children was 8 miles away, but Dorothy could never attend. "We needed every hand in the field," her mother used to say with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry, baby, but we gotta eat." At 7 years old, Dorothy was already working in the harvest. At 12, she cooked for the entire family while her mother worked as a domestic servant in town. Education was a luxury that poor black families in Mississippi couldn't afford in the 1940s and 1950s. Even when schools were available, they were precarious, distant, and many children needed to work to help the family survive. Dorothy learned to sign her name, Dorothy Johnson, drawing the letters her mother showed her, but without understanding what each letter meant or how they came together to form words. At 16 years old in 1955, Dorothy met James Johnson at a Baptist church. He was 5 years older, worked at a sawmill and, miracle of miracles, could read a little. He had managed to attend school until 4th grade. For Dorothy, that was impressive. They married in 1956, And James always read everything to her. Bills, letters, medicine instructions, everything. He never made her feel bad for not being able to read. "Ain't your fault," he would say. "The world didn't give you a chance." In 1962, fleeing the racial violence that exploded in Mississippi after the civil rights movement gained momentum, Dorothy and James migrated north, settling in Asheville, North Carolina, where James had a cousin. There, James got a job at a furniture factory and Dorothy started working as a housekeeper in hotels. They built a modest but dignified life. They had 5 children: Mary, Robert, James Jr., Patricia, and Michael. Dorothy was determined that her children would have what she didn't: education. Every day, even exhausted after long shifts cleaning hotel rooms, Dorothy checked if the children had done their homework. She couldn't help them with their assignments, but she made sure they sat at the table and did them. "Y'all gonna finish school, you hear me?" she said firmly. "I don't care what you become, but you gonna know how to read and write. You ain't gonna have the life your mama had." And it worked. All 5 children graduated from high school, something revolutionary for a black family of her generation. But Dorothy's illiteracy created an invisible prison. She couldn't fill out forms by herself. She couldn't read letters from the children's school. She didn't understand medicine labels. When she went to the supermarket, she memorized the appearance of product packages she needed, identifying them by colors and images. She memorized routes because she couldn't read street signs. In restaurants, she always ordered the usual or pointed to someone else's plate. She developed 1,000 strategies to hide her condition, carrying a silent shame she never fully shared, not even with James. In 1987, when Dorothy was 48 years old, James suffered a fatal heart attack at the factory. He died instantly. Dorothy became a widow with 5 children, the 2 youngest still teenagers. It was the darkest moment of her life. James was the one who read everything for her, who protected her from the world of written words. Now she was alone. But Dorothy was a survivor. She took more cleaning shifts, worked at 2, sometimes 3 different jobs. She raised her children with the sweat of her brow, never accepted government help because she had too much pride, even when they went hungry. During all these decades, Dorothy developed an extraordinary practical intelligence. She didn't know how to read, but she was brilliant with numbers. She could calculate in her head better than many people with formal education. She knew exactly how much money she had, how much everything cost, how to make her salary last the entire month. She memorized important phone numbers. She learned to recognize visual signs everywhere. She was an intelligent, capable, strong woman, but the world insisted on treating her as if she were ignorant because she didn't know how to read. And now, at 80 years old, this vulnerability had been exploited in the cruelest way possible, by her own son. Robert Johnson had always been different from his siblings. While Mary became a nurse, James Jr. a mechanic, Patricia a teacher, and Michael works at the post office, Robert always looked for shortcuts. He had completed high school, but never wanted to work hard like his mother. He changed jobs constantly, always involved in dubious schemes, always in debt. At 52 years old, he had already gone through 2 personal bankruptcies and owed money to loan sharks because of gambling. At the end of 2018, Robert was desperate. He owed $85,000 to dangerous people and needed money fast. That's when an unscrupulous real estate broker named David Sullivan made him a proposal. "Your mama's house is in a prime location. We got developers willing to pay good money for properties in that neighborhood. If you can get her to sell, I'll give you 30% of my commission." Robert knew his mother would never sell the house consciously. But he also knew of her vulnerability. Robert began to prepare the ground months before. He visited Dorothy more frequently, brought food, pretended to be concerned. "Mama, you're getting older. Don't you worry about maintaining this big old house," he would say. Dorothy, who loved all her children, was touched by her son's attention. He regained her trust. Then began the phase of papers. First were real documents. Medicare renewal bank forms. "Just sign here, Mama. I'll take care of everything." Dorothy signed, grateful to have such an attentive son. In February 2019, Robert arrived with the real documents, the deed of sale of the house. But he disguised them. "Mama, remember I told you about that new program for seniors? This here is for you to get a reverse mortgage. You'll get money every month and you can stay in the house till you die. It's free money, Mama." Dorothy, confident, picked up the pen. She signed Dorothy Johnson on the indicated line, her hands carefully drawing each letter of that name she had learned to reproduce 80 years before. Having no idea she was transferring her property for only $15,000, money that Robert pocketed immediately. Sarah, investigating the case in the weeks following the discovery, managed to trace the entire operation. She discovered that David Sullivan worked for a development company that had a history of buying properties from elderly people for below-market values. She discovered that Robert had deposited $15,000 in his account the day after the signature, and that this money disappeared in less than a week, probably going to loan sharks. She discovered that the signature recognition had been done by a corrupt notary public, who wasn't even present when Dorothy signed. When Sarah confronted Robert, he initially denied everything. Then, when presented with the evidence, he became aggressive. "She signed it. It's legal. What you gonna do about it?" Sarah responded. "I'm gonna fight this, and I'm gonna make sure everyone knows what kind of man you are." Robert laughed bitterly. "Good luck with that. The law is on my side." She signed her name. Case closed. But Robert didn't count on Dorothy's determination or the journey she was about to begin. The other siblings were shocked when Sarah told them what had happened. Mary cried for hours. "How could he do this to Mama? After everything she sacrificed for us?" James Jr. wanted to physically confront Robert, but Dorothy stopped them. "No violence in this family, you hear? We're better than that." Patricia, the teacher, suggested, "We need to get a lawyer, Mama. A good 1-inch. Michael, always practical, said, "I'll help pay for it. Whatever it takes." The family united, all except Robert, who disappeared, avoiding calls and confrontations. The lawyer who agreed to take the case pro bono, Jason Mitchell from the Legal Aid Society, was honest from the beginning. "Mrs. Johnson, this is gonna be tough. You signed the documents. Even if we prove you didn't understand what you were signing, the legal bar for overturning a sale is very high. We'd need to prove undue influence, fraud, lack of mental capacity. And the opposing lawyers will argue that you were competent enough to sign your own name." Dorothy listened to everything and simply said, "Do what you can, son. But I'm not giving up my house without a fight. And I'm gonna learn to read. If that's what it takes for people to believe me, that's what I'll do." The morning after hiring the lawyer, Dorothy woke up with a clarity of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She was 80 years old, but something inside her had awakened. Sarah was making coffee when Dorothy appeared in the kitchen and announced, "I'm ready. Teach me." Sarah knew immediately what her grandmother was talking about. "Grandma, are you sure? I mean, it's gonna be hard work." Dorothy interrupted her. "Baby, I picked cotton under the Mississippi sun. I cleaned hotel toilets for 30 years. I raised 5 kids by myself after your grandpa died. Don't tell me about hard work." Sarah was a literacy teacher at an elementary school, but she had never taught an adult to read, much less someone 80 years old. She knew that adult brains learn differently from children's brains. But there was something in Dorothy's determination that convinced her it was possible. That afternoon, Sarah went to the public library and borrowed all the books she found on adult literacy. She discovered that there were about 32 million illiterate adults in the United States. Dorothy was not alone. The first lesson happened that same night at the kitchen table. Sarah started with the basics, the alphabet. "Okay, Grandma, this is the letter A. It makes the sound A like in apple." Dorothy looked at that strange symbol. She had seen it all her life everywhere but had never really seen it. Now she was paying attention. She repeated, "A, apple." Sarah smiled encouragingly. "That's right. Now let's try B." The first weeks were brutally difficult. Dorothy had 80 years of established neural habits. Her brain wasn't used to processing written symbols. The letters seemed to dance on the page. She confused B and D, P and Q. She got frustrated to tears. "I can't do this, Sarah. I'm too old. My brain don't work like it used to." Sarah would take her grandmother's hands and say, "Yes, you can. You just learned what the letter A is. Yesterday you didn't know that. Tomorrow you'll know even more." Dorothy practiced obsessively. She woke up at 5 in the morning and traced letters on paper before Sarah woke up. She carried cards with the alphabet wherever she went. At the supermarket, she tried to recognize letters on packages. At church, during hymns, she tried to follow the words in the hymnal, even though she had no idea what they said. Her granddaughter had stuck post-its with names on everything in the house. Door, window, table, chair. Dorothy walked around the house touching each object and saying its name, trying to connect the physical object with those mysterious symbols. After 3 weeks, Dorothy managed to recognize and write all 26 letters of the alphabet. It was a monumental victory. Sarah bought a small cake and they celebrated. "You did it, Grandma. You know the alphabet." Dorothy, with tears in her eyes, said, "I'm 80 years old and I just learned my ABCs. Ain't that something?" But she knew that was just the beginning. Knowing the letters was one thing. Transforming them into words and understanding what those words meant was something completely different. Sarah then introduced the concept of phonetics. How letters come together to form sounds that become words. "Okay, Grandma, when you put CAT together it sounds like cat." Dorothy tried. Cat. She had read her first word. The emotion was overwhelming. Dorothy started to cry and Sarah did too. In that moment, Dorothy was no longer a victim of her own illiteracy. She was fighting back letter by letter, word by word. As Dorothy progressed in her literacy, she began to see the world in a completely new way, and it wasn't always beautiful. For the first time in her life, she could read street signs. She could read menus in restaurants. She could read product labels at the supermarket. But she also began to read things she wished she hadn't seen. One day, organizing old papers, she found a yellowed envelope with letters that James, her late husband, had kept. They were letters he had written to her during the first years of marriage, when he needed to spend months working in another city. Dorothy had never read those letters. At the time, James read them aloud to her, but she always felt he skipped parts or summarized. Now, struggling with each word, Dorothy read them on her own. And she discovered profound declarations of love, vulnerabilities that James had never shared verbally, plans and dreams he had for their future. "My dearest, that I miss you more than words can say. When I close my eyes at night, I see your beautiful face and it gives me strength to face another day." Dorothy cried reading those words, feeling James's presence across decades, realizing there were aspects of his love she had never truly known because she couldn't read. But there were more painful discoveries. Reviewing old house documents, Dorothy found the will that she and James had made years ago. Sarah read it with her, patiently explaining each legal clause. Dorothy discovered that James had left the house equally to her and to the 5 children. She always thought the house was entirely hers. That's what Robert told her when James died. Technically, each child had a right to a part. This complicated the legal situation even more. Robert, as co-owner, had more legitimacy to facilitate the sale than they had initially imagined. Lawyer Jason Mitchell had to explain, "Mrs. Johnson, this changes things. Robert had partial ownership. That makes it harder to prove fraud, though we can still argue he manipulated you into selling his and your portions without your informed consent." Dorothy felt the ground collapse again. Not only had she been deceived, but her own ignorance about what James had left for her had created the opportunity for Robert to act. If she had known how to read at the time of James's death, she would have understood the real situation of her property. During this period, Dorothy also faced physical challenges. Her eyes, tired from 80 years of life, ached after long reading sessions. She needed stronger glasses to see small letters. Her hands, arthritic, trembled when holding the pen for too long. There were days when the frustration was so great that she wanted to give up. "What's the point, Sarah? Even if I learn to read, I already lost my house." Sarah would respond, "You're not doing this just for the house, Grandma. You're doing this for you. For your dignity. For every person out there who can't read and feels ashamed." But Dorothy continued, word by word, sentence by sentence. She progressed from simple children's books, "The Cat Sat on the Mat," to more complex texts. Sarah brought stories from the public library, starting with second-grade level books, then third, fourth. Dorothy took hours to read a single page, moving her finger under each word, sounding out each syllable aloud. But she was reading. She was finally, at 80 years old, experiencing the magic that 6-year-old children experience when the code of written language finally makes sense. One night, 6 weeks after starting her literacy journey, Dorothy did something revolutionary. Alone in her room, she picked up the eviction notice that had started everything, and for the first time she read it on her own. She struggled with words like foreclosure, eviction, pursuant, but managed to understand the essence. She had to leave her house. Reading those words with her own eyes, without intermediaries, gave her a sense of control she had never felt before. Yes, the situation was terrible. But now she knew exactly how terrible it was. She was no longer hostage to other people's interpretations. That night, Dorothy made a decision. She would go to court. She would testify. And when the time came, she would read a text to the judge, proving she was learning, proving she had been deceived when she didn't know how to read, proving she deserved a second chance. Sarah doubted. "Grandma, that's only 2 months away. I don't know if—" Dorothy interrupted her. "Then we better get to work, baby. I got a lot of reading to do." Dorothy's story began to spread through the Asheville community. Sarah, seeking support, had shared the situation in local community groups and on social media. The response was overwhelming. People who had never met Dorothy started showing up to help. Margaret, a 68-year-old retired teacher, offered to give literacy classes 3 times a week. "I taught for 40 years," she said. "Let me help." Thomas, a 55-year-old black lawyer who had grown up poor in Alabama, was so touched by the story that he joined Jason Mitchell to work on the case pro bono. "My mama went through something similar," he explained. "Nobody helped her. I'm gonna help Mrs. Dorothy." The local Baptist church, where Dorothy had attended for decades, organized a fundraising campaign. Although the lawyers were working for free, there were court costs, filing fees, expenses with investigators to track Robert's fraud. The congregation, many of them elderly like Dorothy who had known similar discrimination and hardships, donated generously. Pastor Williams said during the sermon, "Sister Dorothy ain't fighting just for herself. She's fighting for all of us who've been taken advantage of, who've been made to feel small because we didn't have the education others had. We gonna stand with her." The local TV channel WLOS News 13 heard about the story and sent a reporter, Keisha Thompson, to interview Dorothy. It was the first time Dorothy spoke publicly about her illiteracy. Sitting in her living room, surrounded by children's books and practice notebooks, she told her story to the cameras. "I lived 80 years being ashamed I couldn't read," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "My own son used that shame to steal from me. But I ain't ashamed no more. I'm learning. It's never too late." The report aired that night and went viral. Suddenly, Dorothy wasn't just an elderly woman fighting to save her house. She became a symbol. Letters arrived from all over the country from other illiterate adults who felt inspired by her courage. A 65-year-old woman from Texas wrote, "I never told nobody I can't read. But seeing you on TV gave me courage. I'm gonna learn too." A 72-year-old man from Florida called Sarah, "Tell your grandma she's a hero. I dropped out in 3rd grade and been faking it ever since. Watching her makes me think I can do it too." Dorothy had inadvertently started a movement. Adult literacy organizations reached out offering resources. The Pro-Literacy America program sent specialized teaching materials. A neuropsychologist from the University of North Carolina, Dr. Michael Chen, who researched learning in the elderly, offered to work with Dorothy. The brain remains plastic even in advanced age, he explained. Mrs. Johnson is proving that neuroplasticity doesn't have an expiration date. I'd like to document her progress for research purposes, if she's willing. Dorothy agreed, hoping her journey could help others. But not all attention was positive. Robert, who had disappeared, started spreading his own version of the facts. He told anyone who would listen that Dorothy was lying, that she had always known how to read and was just pretending to nullify the sale. She's playing y'all, he would say. My mama's a manipulator. She knew exactly what she was signing. Some believed him, especially the development company's lawyer Marcus Webb, who began building a defense based on the idea that Dorothy was faking illiteracy. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 10 weeks after the discovery of the fraud. Jason and Thomas worked tirelessly building the case. They collected decades of evidence of Dorothy's illiteracy. School records showing she never attended school, statements from former employers confirming she always needed help filling out forms, testimonies from friends and family. But the centerpiece of their strategy was Dorothy herself. She would testify. She would tell her story. And in a bold move that made everyone nervous, she would read a text she would write in her own words, demonstrating to the court that she was, in fact, learning to read at 80 years old, proving that before she didn't know. The morning of May 15, 2019 dawned clear and cold in Asheville. Dorothy woke up at 4 a.m., unable to sleep. She had practiced her testimony hundreds of times. Sarah had helped her write a brief text, just 2 paragraphs, that she would read in court. Dorothy had memorized every word, but she wanted to read, really read from the pages she herself had written with her trembling handwriting. She put on her best dress, the navy blue one she wore for special occasions at church, and left with Sarah, Mary, James Jr., Patricia, and Michael to Buncombe County Courthouse. The courtroom was packed. Members of the church congregation, neighbors, journalists, people from the community who had heard her story. Pastor Williams was there, as was Margaret, her volunteer teacher. Even people Dorothy didn't know personally, but who had been touched by her story had traveled hours to be present. On the other side of the room, Robert sat with Marcus Webb, the development company's lawyer. He avoided looking at his mother or siblings. James Jr. had to be restrained by Patricia when he saw Robert. "Not here," she whispered. "Let Mama handle this her way." Judge Harold Morrison, a 60-year-old man with a reputation for being fair but rigorous, entered the courtroom. Case number 2019 CV, 1847. Dorothy Mae Johnson versus Summit Development Corporation and Robert Johnson, announced the clerk. Jason Mitchell presented the opening arguments, detailing how Dorothy had been deceived due to her illiteracy, how Robert had exploited maternal trust, how the sale had been conducted for an absurdly low value. Marcus Webb, the defense attorney, argued that Dorothy had signed voluntarily, that the signature was legitimate, that there was no evidence of coercion at the time of signing. Then came the moment of Dorothy's testimony. She walked to the witness chair with slow but determined steps. Sarah saw her grandmother's hands trembling as she took the oath. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" Dorothy placed her hand on the Bible and said with a clear voice, "I do." Jason Mitchell began gently. "Mrs. Johnson, can you tell the court about your education?" Dorothy took a deep breath and began. "Your Honor, I was born in 1939 in Mississippi. I never went to school, not one single day. My family was sharecroppers, we were poor, and I had to work in the fields since I was a little girl. Back then, in the South, a lot of black children didn't go to school, especially girls. We were needed at home." Her voice was firm now, telling the story she had lived. "I got married at 16 to a good man, James Johnson. He could read a little bit and he always took care of reading things for me. I never felt bad about it with him. He made me feel like it was okay." Dorothy continued, describing how she raised 5 children, how she worked hard shifts as a housekeeper, how she became a widow and continued fighting alone. "I raised my babies to value education, Your Honor. All 5 of them graduated high school. I made sure of that, even though I couldn't help them with homework. I didn't want them to have the life I had. She paused, looking directly at Robert for the first time. I trusted my son Robert. He's my child. When he brought papers for me to sign, I believed him when he said they were for my benefits, for my health insurance. Why would I think my own son would steal from me? Marcus Webb stood up for cross-examination. His strategy was to discredit Dorothy. Mrs. Johnson, you say you can't read, but you can sign your name, correct? Dorothy nodded. Yes, sir. I learned to draw my name when I was a girl. My mama showed me the letters and I memorized the shape. But I didn't know what the letters meant. I just knew how to draw them. Webb pressed. Isn't it convenient that you suddenly claim you couldn't read only after you regret selling your house? How do we know you're not just lying to get out of a legal contract? The room fell silent. Dorothy looked at the lawyer with a dignity that silenced even the most skeptical. Sir, I lived 80 years being ashamed that I couldn't read. I hid it from everybody. I pretended to look for my glasses when people gave me menus. I memorized bus routes because I couldn't read street signs. I had my grandbabies read my mail for me. Why would I tell the whole world about my shame if it wasn't true? Ain't no pride in admitting you're illiterate. But I'm done being ashamed. And I'm done being a victim. Jason then made his decisive move. Your Honor, Mrs. Johnson has something she'd like to read to the court. There was a murmur in the room. Dorothy picked up a paper with trembling hands. It was the text she had written with Sarah's help, but that she had practiced reading alone hundreds of times. She adjusted her glasses and began slowly sounding out each word carefully. My name is Dorothy Johnson. I am 80 years old. For my whole life, I could not read. Tears streamed down Dorothy's face, but she continued word by word. 2 months ago, I learned that my son stole my house because I could not read what I was signing. No, I am learning to read. It's hard, but I will not give up. I want my house back. I want my dignity back. Thank you. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Then, spontaneously, someone started applauding. Soon the entire gallery was on their feet, applauding. Judge Morrison banged his gavel. Order! Order in the court. But even he had tears in his eyes. Marcus Webb had no more questions. There was no way to attack that moment. Dorothy had proven irrefutably that she was learning to read, which meant that just 10 weeks before, when she signed the documents, she genuinely didn't know what she was signing. Other testimonies followed. Mary testified about how her mother always needed help reading. James Jr. brought documents from former employers. Margaret, the volunteer teacher, described the literacy sessions. Dr. Chen presented neuropsychological data about Dorothy's progress, scientific evidence that she was, in fact, learning reading skills for the first time. A private investigator brought evidence that the notary who had recognized Dorothy's signature had a history of irregularities. Finally, it was Robert's turn. He was called to the witness stand, but invoked his Fifth Amendment right, refusing to testify so as not to incriminate himself. This decision, although his constitutional right, didn't make him look good before the court. Marcus Webb tried to minimize the damage, but the case was clearly going badly for the defense. The evidence was overwhelming. Dorothy had been exploited, manipulated, and robbed by her own son, who used her illiteracy as a weapon against her. Judge Morrison announced he would give his decision in 1 week. That was the longest week of Dorothy's life. She continued practicing reading, now working on 5th grade level texts. Sarah had bought a collection of short stories, and Dorothy read one each night, even when her eyes ached, even when the words seemed impossible. She was reading not just to recover her house, but because she had discovered something transformative. The power of written words, the entire world she had lost for 80 years. On May 22, 2019, Dorothy returned to court to hear Judge Morrison's decision. She was nervous but at peace. Regardless of the outcome, she had achieved something no one could take from her: the ability to read. The courtroom was packed again. The judge entered, his expression serious and impenetrable. "I have reviewed all the evidence presented in this case," he began. "This is one of the most troubling cases of elder abuse I have encountered in my 20 years on the bench." Judge Morrison looked directly at Dorothy. "Mrs. Johnson, your testimony moved this court deeply. The evidence clearly shows that you were a victim of fraud and undue influence. Your son exploited your trust and your illiteracy to steal your property. The notarization was irregular. The sale price was unconscionable, less than 10% of market value. Most compellingly, your courage in learning to read at 80 years old demonstrates beyond any doubt that you were genuinely unable to understand what you were signing 2 months ago." Dorothy felt the tears coming. "Therefore, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff. The sale is hereby nullified and deemed void ab initio, meaning it is as if it never happened. The property is restored to Mrs. Dorothy Johnson and her children. Furthermore, I am referring Robert Johnson to the District Attorney for Criminal Investigation of Fraud and Elder Abuse. Summit Development Corporation is ordered to pay all court costs and legal fees." The gavel struck. Dorothy had won. The room exploded in celebration. Sarah hugged her grandmother, both crying. Mary, Patricia, and Michael joined the embrace. James Jr., the most emotional of the siblings, couldn't stop crying. Pastor Williams led a prayer of gratitude right there in the courtroom. Strangers who had followed the story came to congratulate Dorothy. Keisha Thompson, the reporter, captured everything on video, images that would be broadcast nationally that night. Robert left the courtroom quickly, avoiding cameras and family. Weeks later, he would be formally charged with elder fraud, a federal crime. Eventually, he would accept a plea deal that included financial restitution, probation, and community service. Dorothy refused to press charges to the maximum. "He's still my son," she said. "I don't want him in prison. I want him to get help and become a better man." This grace, even after such betrayal, impressed everyone who knew the story. But Dorothy's journey didn't end there. She continued learning to read, progressing rapidly now that the pressure of the trial had passed. 6 months later, she was reading 8th grade level books. A year later, she read her first complete novel, The Color Purple by Alice Walker, chosen because it told stories of Black women overcoming adversity, something that resonated deeply with her own life. Took 3 months to finish, but she read every word. Dorothy became an adult literacy activist. She started giving talks at libraries, schools, and community organizations. "Ain't never too late to learn," she would say. "I'm living proof of that. If I can do it at 80, anybody can do it." She volunteered with Pro-Literacy America, mentoring other illiterate adults who felt ashamed to seek help. Her story inspired thousands of people across the country to finally admit they couldn't read and seek education. Sarah wrote a book about her grandmother's journey, titled Never Too Late: How My Grandmother Learned to Read at 80. The book became a regional bestseller and was adapted into a documentary produced by PBS. Dorothy, now a local mini-celebrity, used the platform to advocate for better adult literacy programs and stronger protections for the elderly against fraud. She testified before the North Carolina legislature, helping to pass stricter laws against financial abuse of the elderly. On her 82nd birthday, Dorothy did something she never imagined possible. She read aloud at church a passage from Psalm 23 before the entire congregation. Her voice trembled, but every word was clear. When she finished, the entire church stood in ovation. Pastor Williams had tears streaming down his face. "This is what resurrection looks like," he said. Sister Dorothy died to her old life and was born again into a new one, at 80 years old. Hallelujah! Dorothy still lives in her house in Asheville, the house she almost lost, the house she fought to keep. Every morning, she sits on the porch with a cup of coffee and the local newspaper, reading the day's news. She reads slowly, still struggles with difficult words, but she reads. She corresponds by letter with other adults learning to read. Her words of encouragement written in her own hand. At Christmas, for the first time in 80 years, she wrote Christmas cards to all her children and grandchildren. Simple messages, but they meant the world to her. People ask me if I'm angry about all those years I lost not being able to read, Dorothy says. I tell them I don't think about what I lost. I think about what I gained. I gained freedom. I gained power. I gained the ability to protect myself. And most importantly, I proved to myself and to the world that it's never, ever too late to change your life. If an old lady like me can learn to read at 80, then there ain't nothing impossible in this world. Nothing at all. Dorothy Mae Johnson's story teaches us profound lessons about human dignity, perseverance, and the transformative capacity of education. It shows us that it's never too late to change our lives, that shame can be transformed into courage, that vulnerability can become strength. Dorothy didn't just recover her house. She recovered her voice, her power, her autonomy. Today, there are millions of illiterate adults or adults with limited literacy in the United States and around the world. Many carry silent shame, developing elaborate strategies to hide their condition. Dorothy's story invites them to come out of the shadows, to seek help, to realize they are not alone and that it's never too late to learn. This is a story about family betrayal, but also about forgiveness. About injustice, but also about redemption. About loss, but fundamentally about gain. The invaluable gain of knowledge, of literacy, of the power to read the words that shape our lives. Dorothy Mae Johnson, at 80 years old, proved that age is just a number, that the human brain is more resilient than we imagine, and that determination can move mountains. Her final message to the world is simple but powerful. Don't ever let nobody make you feel small because of what you don't know. What matters is what you're willing to learn. And it's never, never too late to start.